Welcome, dear Rafa, to our fourth episode of But What Does It Mean? Our new podcast. And today we were looking into the usefulness and effectiveness of international law. We have been seeing like the war that Israel and the United States are right now launching against and raging against Iran. This debate happened when the Kremlin attacked Ukraine. This debate also is underway since the war on Gaza, the war in Gaza by the Israeli military, this campaign. My students at NYU actually pointed out, where I'm teaching political theory and democratic theory, they said, like, well, wait, what's the difference now between Russia attacking Ukraine and between Israel and Gaza? And now we hear the same thing, like with the attack on Iran. They say, but is there like an imminent threat that would allow the proclamation of war, which, by the way, in the case of the United States, did not happen through Congress? So, like, when you look at all this, like, is international law dead, Rafat?
Again, thank you, Alex, for being here today and having the opportunity, giving me the opportunity to engage with you. Look, international law is not dead, but it's certainly being battered and challenged and tested. International law has a basic underlying premise, is that we all want to follow those laws. There has been a debate, for example, in the Singapore Parliament recently, asking how would Singapore react to the Malacca Straits and if anything would happen to close the shipping lines that go through there. And actually, whilst we've all heard now over the last few weeks that 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a far greater percentage of world trade passes through the Malacca Straits and down through Singapore and the Straits of Singapore. And that stretch of waterway, at its narrowest, is only 2.1 miles compared with the 21 miles that the Strait of Hormuz has. And the question was asked was, under what circumstances could Singapore see itself charging for vessels to have free passage, safe passage, if you like, through these waters? And Vivian Balakrishnan, the Singapore minister, made the very important point that, look, the law of the seas effectively guarantees the free movement of ships, trade around the world for the benefit of the entire world. And therefore, it is not the right of one party to be able to close off a waterway and hold others or the rest of the world to ransom in return for that. Either you have a rules-based order or it's total anarchy. And that he could not see any circumstances under which Singapore would be looking to violate international law and obviously charge for the right to pass through those waterways.
Yeah, and not too far away from Singapore, because we're talking about the waterways and their openness. Because when you talk about international law, some say like, oh, this is just a lofty like human rights and whatever. But from these basic assumptions, they are also derived like really clear-cut like demands for trade. Because if we believe like in dignity of all, that means also like trade is like so to speak beatified or sanctified by this. Like you can go on trade, but you need to have free passage. And you see the People's Republic of China like seeming to be like willing to inflict on this free passage in the Strait of Taiwan, where you have like these two former civil war states entities like battling each other. So the waterways and the free passage, that's not just like a romantic add-on, is it? It's just like very detrimental to a functioning international order, right?
Oh, very much so. As we've seen, if you remember 2+ years ago, when suddenly I think it was a Korean tanker, a container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
I mean, within days of that happening, the international supply chain was being affected and prices were jumping all over the place. And it took several weeks before that was finally resolved, because in the interim, whilst the Suez Canal was blocked, there were ships that were queuing to come up. They could not go through, so they had to pass around the bottom of Africa and come back to Europe, for example, particularly if they were carrying cargo that was time sensitive. So yes, the freedom of movement of trade, if you like, and one doesn't necessarily have to be a capitalist or have some other view of world economic order, but the freedom of movement of trade is fundamental to how we live in the 21st century. And if that begins to break down, sure, prices of goods can only go one way, and that's something that then that has obviously different consequences.
But this is from the dawn of time, like Roman coins making their way into China, the spread, if you so will, of ideas and religions through armies and merchants. So that's like for the spread of Christianity and Buddhism is like detrimental. So to now make a case against that sounds to me like to make a case against like historic realities, but like coming to another flow, not only goods but the flow of people, if I may say so. And we have another field where many would argue that international law is like not working as it should be, and that's in regard to refugees or migrants in a more broader sense. The EU has agreed to have like help by countries in northern Africa to deal with sub-Saharan migrants, refugees that come through these countries on their way to Europe. Italy in 2024 aimed to start some sort of camp in Albania, which the courts put a stop on for the moment, and it's under scrutiny. So would that not also be like a sellout of one of the basic and core ideas of international law to somehow safeguard refugees, to enable, even though it sounds a little technical, to enable the flow of humans throughout the world?
I think one of the issues that we have to accept, Alex, today is that many of the basic tenets of international law that came out of the Second World War, again, one would argue were drafted at a different time with perhaps different aims in mind, and that are they as applicable today to where the idea that in your palm, on your smartphone, you have the sum total of human knowledge in the palm of your hand. There's no question that you can't get an answer to. There's no AI agent that doesn't give you answers. When you have that much information from the aftermath of the Second World War, I think the international, the Geneva Convention, the Refugee Convention of 1951, was designed for a particular purpose, whether we'd like to admit it or not, and I would perhaps choose my words slightly carefully. I think what was the Refugee Convention in 1951 really is not fit for purpose today. And you might argue that, therefore, if you were trying to put together the Refugee Convention today, it would look very different. At least many parts of it would look very different in terms of the absolute the right to asylum, to refuge, if you like, would not be enshrined in quite the same sort of way. And I think one has to be, frankly, realistic, brutally realistic. The Refugee Convention came about primarily as a way for certain nations to assuage their guilt in terms of how they treated particularly Jewish people during the Second World War, had ignored the plight, the Holocaust, and this was a way of saying, okay, we now have a Refugee Convention which allows the freedom of movement of people primarily to go and settle in other Western countries. Maybe some go to the US, and many did. But that was the purpose, if you like. And ironically, today, almost 80-odd years later, the vast majority of those that are taking advantage of the Refugee Convention are those that at the time of the original Refugee Convention would have been the colonized. And there was certainly no imagination, no possibility that these vast armies of African people or people from Asia or the Middle East would daring to be even thinking they could come to the West and settle in the way that they have done. And I'm being deliberately provocative, but I think one has to accept the fact that if you accept the premise that the convention is no longer fit for purpose, which is what many European leaders would argue, perhaps some more openly than others, then the fact is that the rules would have been different. Today, the vast majority of the vast majority of those that are taking advantage are from the former colonies, are from Africa, are from parts of the Middle East, and would they have been afforded the same kind of rights if the authors of that convention had necessarily known that large numbers of migrants, now one can debate about what is large or not large, are taking advantage and therefore automatically able to settle in some countries, or at least able to seek asylum. So I should be very clear that there's no automatic right to anything, but able to seek asylum. Yes, I think that's and that coupled with the something that we've touched upon several times in the last few weeks is that, again, the idea that the freedom of movement of peoples, the idea that you can simply push people together and expect and hope that they will settle amicably has clearly been strained. And so I think that the Refugee Convention certainly serves a purpose. It's an admirable document, but it like many other international treaties that trace their foundations, their origins back to the early 50s, and certainly early 60s, do need updating. And that's, I don't think any sane person can argue otherwise. The other point I was going to make, Alex, was that with your reference to camps, I think we have to accept that the inability to process the numbers of people that are seeking to migrate at this moment in time from Africa, from the Middle East, from parts of Asia, and who knows, maybe at some stage from Latin America, but that's a different story, and the demographics around that are very different. I think, though, we have to accept the reality that maybe not camps, but certainly processing centers. Countries have to make, from the West in particular, need to make that investment. We've talked about actual investment, but if you're going to make it easier, more dignified for people to go through that application process, and you want them hopefully to stay where they are, then you must provide the infrastructure that if they choose not to stay, that they are able to go through a process, have their application determined within a reasonable period of time, not sitting there for potentially a year, 2 years and getting nowhere and frustrated, and then what? Because let's face it, Alex, the point is, if you're sitting in Somalia, and I say hello to my Somali friends, but if you are in a position where you're able to raise $10,000 to $15,000 to pay a people smuggler to take you all the way to Europe, that $10,000 to $15,000 could be spent far more productively, you could argue, within your own home country to set up a small business, to set up a trading business or a little shop or whatever else there might be. That should be encouraged. And yes, if you still decide that you want to migrate, then make the migration process shorter, sharper, more dignified than it is at this moment in time. Because if you don't do that, then don't be surprised by the numbers that you're across the Mediterranean and ultimately across the channel increasing dramatically, Alex.
And that's exactly the word, like the key word, dignified. I mean, we know that under Barack Obama, so far more people from Mexico were deported who were not allowed to stay longer in the United States. And you see how non-dignified the process is under the Trump administration, leaving out how much more money it costs and how much fear it deploys in the populace, in also with people who have legal status in the United States. I think when we talk about dignified, that's something the European Union also needs to take to mind and call to mind, because ultimately we know what the Trump administration is doing, sending people to countries that are not their origin and just let them rot there in prisons, cannot be the way to tackle what you just described so colorfully.
You can't, but I would just say one last thing, which is that, look, what President Trump has shown is that if you want to follow through with an agenda, you can. One of the biggest and most frustrating aspects of whether any kind of policy making in the West is the inertia that seems to come in, the inevitable debate, and it goes on and on and on. Some issues are too important to be left to endless debate. and you have to take a decision. Now, one may not like the way that the President Trump has executed some of his immigration or the deportations, and the way ICE has gone to those cities. And
I mean, they are illegal by the court's ruling, so
by the
it's
courts.
kind of like.
But at least if you are determined to take decisions, then take them firmly, make them quickly, rather than just wallowing in endless debate, because that is part of what is exacerbating the problems today, Alex.
I mean, this is also something that clearly this new generation, my students that I talked about before, have like laid out too. And it's true that much of what we today herald as the international rules-based order terminology by Barack Obama, which sounds to be coming and hailing to us from the 50s of the last century, but they were like written and enabled at a time when colonies were still a thing, and Angola and Algeria and Indonesia have not yet fully gotten their independence, which they had to fight for. So I agree with you, and it feels like that particularly England and France, who have been vast colonial powers at the time, they still grapple with the aftermath and after effects of this, let's say, dichotomy, if you want to call it like that you have liberal ideas like marching and triumphing in the world at the time where like many people were all but not yet sovereign. But then, like, looking into the world today, it's interesting what we were saying. Like, the same is true in Germany, where like the right to asylum, I think when it was enshrined in the constitution, in our Grundgesetz, it meant to, like, if professors in Turkey or any other country are persecuted, they can come, groups of religious groups or artists or whatever. But now we live in a world where reality is that, like, climate migration, economic migration is a thing for like larger groups than just a few professors, and that's not with any thought against or anyone. But I feel like also Germany is struggling, like, how do we change our system to be suitable for a different world?
Absolutely, Alex. That really is, as I said, how do you adapt and change, right? To the modern reality. Certainly, the scale of economic migration is way beyond what might have been envisaged back in the early 1950s. And the source of that migration, the reality is, however much one might sort of find it distasteful, that there is clearly an element of, well, these people that are coming don't look like us. They don't speak our language. They don't have our same culture, and they have some different religions, and they do odd things. And I'm just not comfortable with this. Not me, but I'm just saying that is something that, particularly in the aftermath of the great financial crisis of 2008, 9, 10, where many would argue we're still paying the price of what happened in the run-up to that, and that we've not fully recovered, and therefore fundamentally people, and I'm now talking specifically, let's say, Europe, and I'll say why, I explain why I'm talking about Europe, but still do not feel happy in terms of their economic prospects. The fact that graduates in the UK are finding it struggling to find a job that at levels that were unimaginable even 5 years ago, right? And now they're faced with additional competition from the likes of artificial intelligence and robotics and so on and so forth. This is fundamentally changing societies and the willingness to be liberal-minded, if you like. When your rice bowl is threatened, then clearly you have a very different attitude, perhaps, than you might have when there's plenty of rice and it's flowing and the wine is flowing and jobs are plentiful. It's clearly, this is not an unreasonable situation we find ourselves in. And again, one of the things you and I have talked about many times is that, look, we're talking about the Refugee Convention, but more broadly, there are issues around migration that are just not being addressed. The fact is that by 2050, there is a statistic that's often quoted, and I'm as guilty as others of quoting it far too often, but that by 2050, approximately 1 in 3 people on the planet will be African. Now, that's a pretty daunting number in some respects, and not only is it 1 in 3 people that will be African, but also the vast majority of whom, as much as sort of 60%, will be under the age of 25, if not under the age of 21.
Do we not okay, there is so much potential here, and Europeans talk about building camps and erecting fences and letting people drown, or like not just starting this journey altogether, whereas Africa, these young nations receive every year a record number of investments, so there is like so much positive thought about it and development like this, that large swath of the continent are not just like ready for aid, they are ready like to take off. And why do we not see like also the potential of this whole continent? I mean, the Economist just recently got out new numbers and they were staggering again. So like, what do we not get the memo about like the development in Africa and the opportunities that come because we are still stuck in a somewhat imperial colonial mindset to just think of like lesser beings, sub-Saharan?
We're certainly in a transition mode. The reality is that, as I say, if you are going to have a large young population, if the richer nations, particularly European nations, do nothing about encouraging and job creation, development in Africa, the migration problems that we have today are going to look like child's play compared to the future. Large numbers of young men, in particular, looking for some way to become self-respect, looking for dignity, looking to become useful members of society, will only have one way to go, and that's north. And crossing the Mediterranean and maybe ultimately crossing the English Channel the numbers can only be on a different scale completely from where we are today, unless we put in place the mechanisms you're talking about, the investment that encourages job creation to stay in those societies, and that encourages the youth to be there now.
Yeah, and understood not as aid, but as investment in a prospering continent.
Has to be, because aid can only go so far. And look, Africans, as well as many other societies, are sick and tired of being accused of receiving handouts. They're willing to work. You only have to go to Lagos and see the vibrancy, for example, of Nigeria is a country which is often maligned, but go to Lagos and see how vibrant the tech scene, the music scene, the film scene is. Yeah. It's crazy. Go to Ghana and go and see that given the opportunity, there is an incredible willingness to be able to show that they're as good as anybody else. And the Nigerian diaspora in particular has been incredibly successful outside of Nigeria, as well as now seeking opportunity within Nigeria itself. And this is one area where, for example, I think many had thought, and I for one still believe, that the opportunity lies in taking the fact that, going back to your point about climate change, that the opportunity perhaps is to look at the nature assets of Africa, as we're talking about Africa, look how we can increase investment that allows, for example, nature-based solutions around carbon absorption, carbon credits, and using the funds that can be generated from monies that are coming from West, from China, from other large polluters, if you like, to use that to develop the mangroves, the primary rainforests, biochar, sustainable agriculture, and create good, clean, well-paying jobs within those countries themselves. And I think that's certainly something that is very much doable and should be encouraged further, although that may be a topic for another day. But that's one particular source where look, we're polluting, we're doing things, maybe we can do some offsets and other kind of investments that will help save the planet, good for society as a whole. We can look at those type of situations. But clearly, a young population growing that aspires to everything that richer nations have but has shown itself to be very capable of work.
That's also reminding of like how the so-called Asian tigers came about, by like keeping the money, the investment in the country, making sure that it's brought to fruition in the country. So there's also something that where African leaders can look into the success stories of East Asia and increasingly Southeast Asia. Thank you so much, Rafat, for this episode, and I look already forward to our next one.
Thank you very much.